It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning again, everyone. Now we continue our WNYC Centennial series, 100 Years of 100 Things. Today it's thing number 42, which is actually a person. It's 100 years of Shirley Chisholm, the former Brooklyn Congresswoman, first ever black woman in Congress, and 1972 presidential hopeful, was born 100 years ago this week, November 30th, 1924, just a few months after WNYC was born. 52 years before Kamala Harris became the Democratic presidential candidate, Shirley Chisholm was the first black woman to throw her hat into the ring for that nomination when she was 48.
I would run realizing all of the controversies that would swirl about my head. But when you are a catalyst for change in any society, you have to be prepared.
That from a presidential campaign speech at UCLA in 1972, Shirley Chisholm, the politician, who was also a public intellectual.
I'm a woman that holds 3 college degrees and 10 points for a PhD. I'm not here to boast to you, but I'm just a little bit sick and tired of people not looking at me in terms of my humanity and my capabilities.
That was also from that UCLA campaign speech. We'll hear more archive tape of Shirley Chisholm in this 100-year segment as we go. And we have, I think, the perfect guest to guide us through these clips of Shirley Chisholm in her own words. It's Zinga Fraser, author of a new book called Shirley Chisholm in Her Own Words, Speeches and Writings. Zinga Fraser is director of the Shirley Chisholm Project at Brooklyn College and a professor of Africana Studies and Women's and Gender Studies there. She has also been a consultant to the new movie, Shirley, with Regina King. Dr. Fraser, congratulations on the book, first of all, and thank you so much for joining our series, 100 Years of 100 Things. Welcome to WNYC.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
And before we get to more tape of Shirley Chisholm as an adult, let's talk a little bit about her childhood. Your book reminds us that Shirley Chisholm was born in 1924 to West Indian parents from Barbados who migrated to the United States in the early 1920s. Do you know why they left Barbados and why they chose Brooklyn as a new home?
Well, like a number of West Indians, specifically Bajans, would come to New York City and come to Brooklyn because of economic opportunities. And so they decided to make that sojourn to Brooklyn, where there was a enclave of Bajan in particular, a community in Brooklyn, in Bedford-Stuyvesant, as well as in Williamsburg during that time.
Bajan, for people who don't know, refers to?
Barbadian people.
And you write that Shirley's father, Charles T. Hill, was a laborer who followed and admired Marcus Garvey, read the papers, and engaged in kitchen table debates on local and international news. Can you say a little more about the political conversations that Shirley Chisholm may have been hearing in the earliest years of her life?
Yeah, I mean, her father followed the UNIA. He would take Shirley Chisholm to some of those meetings in Brooklyn and in Harlem. And it was around issues around colonialism, Black empowerment, self-determination. Those were the kind of things that Chisholm grew up hearing. But she also grew up hearing about Marcus Garvey and other kind of great Black leaders from the Caribbean. And so that helped develop a certain kind of self-esteem and understanding of herself, not only as someone who was from Brooklyn, but her diasporic identity.
What kind of laborer was Charles St. Hill? Do you know what he did?
Well, he mainly worked in a bakery in Brooklyn, as well as did some work on the seaport in Brooklyn Seaport, right? The naval base. And so that was his primary occupation.
And you also remind us that because of hard economic times for the family during the Depression in the 1930s, Shirley and her sister were sent back to Barbados to live with their maternal grandmother and attend what you call British-run schools that allowed Chisholm to see some of the influence that British colonial power had on every aspect of Barbadian life. Do you know an example or two of that and how being a kid in the Barbados school system shaped her worldview?
Well, in particular, Chisholm later on in her life was someone who supported, at Brooklyn College, supported a Negro Week, right? A discussion of African and African American history. And she found, the Barbadian school system, in particular, its influence of the British, in particular, for example, having to recite or hail to the Queen and learning British history instead of learning Barbadian or Bayesian history, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so those influences of not necessarily knowing the native history, knowing what all encompassed, their life, but it was many ways influenced by the British. She talked about how that influenced her own understanding of imperialism and colonialism.
And by the end of her childhood, Shirley came back to Brooklyn, got a bachelor's degree at Brooklyn College in 1946 and a master's in education from Columbia in 1952. And you wrote that college life would serve as her entryway into politics. How, for example?
Well, she makes a decision, even though she's majoring in sociology and, fluent in Spanish, she makes a decision also to get involved in politics and also start forming her own kind of collegial politics on Brooklyn campus. She creates a sorority-like organization for Black women because there wasn't any kind of group that was able to foster both education and social as well as political activism. And so she creates Ipathia as an organization. She also meets really great professors who really want her to focus on thinking about the larger aspects of how she operates in her community. And so it's also during that time that she meets Wesley McHolder, right, who is in the NAACP, but also intertwined in Brooklyn politics during that time. And so that's her kind of beginning stages of entering politics and seeing what organizing looked like.
And maybe this is one of the things Shirley Chisholm learned in college. You tell me. Here's a clip of Chisholm. This is from a speech much later in 1983, 9 years after her presidential run at Greenfield High School in Massachusetts. But steeped in history, she invokes how fully women were excluded from the U.S. democracy at the nation's founding, as she invokes a very early American feminist, someone we might call a founding mother.
Abigail Adams, the wife of the second President of the United States of America, in a letter to her husband at the Continental Congress back in the 18th century, she counseled the future President of the United States, and this is what she said thusly. She said, "Remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of husbands. Remember that all men would be tyrants if they could."
Shirley Chisholm, quoting Abigail Adams in 1983. Any context, Dr. Fraser, that you'd like to give for Chisholm invoking Adams or the country's founding?
Well, she always kind of used the framing and some of the framers, the foundational ideologies and women and men who are part of that framing of the country as a dichotomy of what was happening, when she's talking about some of the hypocrisy, right, that existed within our own Constitution, our own Bill of Rights, even how we imagine or reimagine American democracy. And so she was a student, right, of democracy, and she was a student of the Constitution and all of those things. And so it provides such a telling way of how Chisholm also approached her kind of intellectual journey.
Now, listeners, as usual in our 100-year segments, we can take a few oral history calls. Is anyone listening now who knew Shirley Chisholm or worked with her in any way during her lifetime. 212-433-WNYC. I'll bet we have somebody, maybe more than one person out there like that. 212-433-9692. If so, what memory stays with you the most? 212-433-WNYC. Or anyone else of any generation who feels that you've been influenced by Shirley Chisholm. So again, is anyone listening now who knew Shirley Chisholm or worked with her in any way during her lifetime or even met her? If so, what memory stays with you the most? Or anyone else of any generation who feels that you've been influenced by Shirley Chisholm? 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692, with our special guest, Zinga Fraser, director of the Shirley Chisholm Project at Brooklyn College and author of a new book called Shirley Chisholm in Her Own Words, Speeches and Writings, as well as a historical consultant to the movie Shirley with Regina King that's out this year. 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692. And we've got many more clips to play. We haven't even gotten to the presidential campaign yet, or 1968, when Shirley Chisholm became the first black woman ever in the House of Representatives. But since this is a 100-year history of her whole life on this week of what would be Shirley Chisholm's 100th birthday, back to Shirley in college for one more question, because your book, Dr. Fraser, reminds us that black women were excluded from Brooklyn College's social clubs during the time she was in school in the late 40s. This was Brooklyn, New York City, not the Jim Crow South, but that segregation was stated and official?
Yes, it was. And so it's also important to note how Brooklyn College, as much as we like to kind of rally CUNY as being a college for all people, right, all backgrounds, there was a small population. There weren't that many African-American or Afro-Caribbean people even being accepted into Brooklyn College. It was very elite during that time. And so, Chisholm really does enter Brooklyn College or enters the CUNY system during a time where they are collectively collectively working against the institutions around race and gender, and holding the institution to toll on those issues.
So here's another clip of Shirley Chisholm, originally aired on WNYC and featured in a Museum of the City of New York exhibition on her life that I know you were co-curator of. And the museum says, before she entered public life as an elected official, Shirley Chisholm launched a career in early education, working as a teacher's aide. And this clip has Chisholm advocating for integration through busing of public school students. I'm not sure of the exact year. Maybe you'll tell us after the clip, but here's Shirley Chisholm on busing in the 60s.
I'm so perturbed over the fact that all you have to do nowadays is just to mention the word busing. And the moment that word is mentioned, there's an emotionalism that's built up. And one of the reasons that I have for busing, because I am so shocked at the depth of the racism in this country, that I really believe that unless white children and black children have an opportunity to have some kind of ongoing relationships with each other as they're growing up, that seed also will be reproduced in the next generation, and we don't want it. We don't want it. I'll finish in a few minutes. I just want to say, oh, how my heart bleeds for the people in the country now that are saying we do not want to bus our children out of the neighborhood. Where were all of these voices for years in the South when black children were bused right past the white schools in the southern neighborhoods, going to schools in the most kind of dilapidated, put-together shacks, going to bathrooms, I call them outhouses.
Shirley Chisholm on the bad old kind of busing and the kind that she was advocating at that time. And actually, Dr. Fraser, I think I was corrected by my producer that That clip was not from the 60s, but during her presidential campaign in 72.
Yeah.
So would you talk about that clip and how it might have fit into her role as a political advocate or organizer around education issues before her political career?
Yeah, well, I think the clip really does show how Chisholm is talking about busing. In particular, it was a hot button issue in the 72 campaigns within the Democratic Party as well as within the Republican Party. And you have a huge contingent of segregationists who were against busing in particular. And so Chisholm, in many ways talks about busing to the political chagrin of a lot of her supporters, as well as, well, not her supporters, but her advisors, right? That they thought that she really should not come out for busing because it provided many ways for her not to receive a significant support in the southern states. And so Chisholm understood what busing meant in the urban areas in which she represented a large portion, and understood busing as a way to talk about the educational and economic inequalities that are surrounding public schools and the ways in which we use property taxes and all of those things to fund schools, and how segregation as well as urban areas have really limited the resources within Black and Brown communities. And so Chisholm, makes a hard stance around busing and, talks about a larger framework when we think about segregation.
Let's take a phone call. Don in Manhattan, who I think is going to say he worked on Shirley Chisholm's first campaign for elected office. Don, do I have that right? You're on WNYC. Hello.
Yeah. Talk about a larger framework. When Shirley Chisholm's first run against Congresswoman Edna Kelly, who represented Bedford-Stuyvesant, she said one of the ways to beat Edna Kelly was to go into the projects to register voters. And her first run, she didn't make it, but the second time around, using that strategy, she got more people to vote to ouster Congresswoman Edna Kelly.
And what was your role, Don? What did you do?
I was just somebody. I'm from the South, and we registered voters, so we went into knocking on doors in the projects to ask people to register to vote. And a lot of people weren't registered because they come from the South and you couldn't vote down South, and come to New York. It was a novel idea to register to vote.
Wow.
This was in 64.
Thank you, Don. That is some story, Dr. Fraser.
Yeah, well, it's important to note the discussion around Chisholm going to the projects. Chisholm really went everywhere where there were people, right? And even she talks about her shrekking the respectability politics of her day, right? Going to street corners and saloons or bars, right, to register people to vote. She would go anywhere where the people were. So that's definitely a testament of what Shirley Chisholm embodied in terms of her political strategies and organizing and connecting to everyday people.
Thank you for that call, Don. And let's take another one right now before we continue on the timeline and get to the presidential campaign and her days in the state assembly, by the way, which don't get as well remembered. Eleanor in Oceanside, you're on WNYC. Hi, Eleanor.
Hi, Brian. Hello, Dr. Fraser. I was a teacher. I'm now retired, but in around 1970, I taught at Ocean Hill, Brownsville, school, elementary school, and we met her. She came to our school, and I was immediately struck by her straightforwardness, her feeling of honesty. Just I can't, even today, I almost. I'm overwhelmed whenever I think of her. She was just so wonderful in that things that she said. I'm Jewish. It's like I was saying, I wanted to say the things that she said. My feelings were her feelings. It was a community I felt was in her. I just can't say enough about her. She really, to this day, I just like what she said.
Does any line or anything from her stick with you? Or is it too far in the distance?
Yes, it was. It was a long time ago, but I still remember her presence, her straightforwardness, just the way she. I don't want to say attacked, but she just said things that needed to be said. That's how I felt. And she just visited our school one day. Mm-hmm. I just remember, even though it was like maybe 1970.
One visit to your school, and she impressed you that much, and it stayed with you all these years. Eleanor, thank you for that piece of oral history. And it's funny she mentions Ocean Hill-Brownsville because, of course, Dr. Fraser, as I'm sure you know, that was the kind of the central neighborhood focus of the big New York City teachers' strike in the fall of 1968 over community control of the schools, which black leaders in the neighborhood in particular wanted. Was Shirley Chisholm involved in that?
Yes, she was. And she really found a way to try to merge, because being a former teacher herself, merge the issues around teachers as well as the importance that she also believed in having community control and engagement, in particular Black and Brown communities, to have a role in terms of the curriculum, have a role in terms of increasing the number of teachers that, represented that community. And so Chisholm was very much a part of that history of that time. And, in some ways, some people didn't like her stances, right? And others, a number of people supported her. But she really was about trying find the best way to support schools, to support children, to get the best education that they required and needed.
And listeners, if you're just joining us, it's 100 years of Shirley Chisholm in our 100 Years series today. The former Brooklyn Congresswoman and 1972 presidential hopeful was born 100 years ago this week, November 30th, 1924. Our guest is Zinga Fraser, director of the Shirley Chisholm Project at Brooklyn College and author of a new book called Shirley Chisholm in Her Own Words, Speeches, and Writings, as well as a consultant to the Museum of the City of New York, or co-curator of the Museum of the City of New York exhibit on Chisholm, and the movie Chisholm with Regina King. Who else has an oral history memory to share, or any other question? 212-433-WNYC, 212-433-9692. Kevin in Denver, I see you. You're going to be the next call when we get to the presidential run. But before she became the first black woman ever elected to Congress, Shirley Chisholm got elected to the New York State Assembly. So, Dr. Fraser, did she have any specific state-level policy focus or accomplishments that you want to recall?
Yes. I think the most important legislation that since we're talking about education, is the SEEK program that provided resources. Is still in working today. There are tons of SEEK students. It provided resources as well as scholarship to students from marginalized communities, in particular those who were poor or working class. And so Chisholm understood what it meant to have that kind of support, not only financial support, but as well as mentorship and engagement of those students from the beginning as freshmen to their senior year. Since Chisholm, as I wrote in the book, was able to receive admittance into some of the most kind of prestigious schools like Vassar and others, but she could not afford, because of her family background, she could not afford to go to those schools. And so, as we know, CUNY was free for most students during the time. And unlike for students, when she gets into this assembly, I mean, it still is free, but she understood the toll it took for a number of students to receive funding as well as resources to support them. And so I would say that was probably one of the most kind of major legislations that she's able to pass in the state assembly, and her working with people like Percy Sutton and others to ensure that that legislation got passed.
That's a good one. You may get free tuition, but you still have to put a roof over your head and food on your plate. So in 1968, she's elected to Congress, first black woman ever. And in 1969, she gives one of her famous speeches in support of the Equal Rights Amendment. Here's a 20-second clip.
I have been far oftener discriminated against because I am a woman than because I am black. Prejudice against blacks is becoming unacceptable, although it will take years to eliminate it. Prejudice against women is still acceptable.
And she didn't have the music bed at that time, but obviously a very dramatic and a very famous Shirley Chisholm moment. And I think Amanda in Manhattan is calling about exactly that clip. Amanda, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Hello, Brian. Yes, and now that you've played the clip, you've stepped on my lines. But what I further am now thinking of is Maya Angelou's line about how you may not remember what people said or what they did, but you remember how they made you feel. And I can tell you that Shirley Chisholm was so exciting for women. I'm white. My mother, was white and Jewish and adored. We all adored Shirley Chisholm because she was so articulate, so strong, so insistent, and, just didn't take no guff. And I guess I remember at the time being somewhat surprised. I mean, we had been activists in civil rights and stuff, and I think I was taken aback at first. I was in my teens at the time, I guess. That someone would say that they had been more discriminated against as a woman than as a black person. But this just, all these years later, that is the one thing that really stands out. Yeah.
Amanda, thank you. Thank you. And so, Dr. Fraser, would you talk about that speech or the framing in that clip, which seems to compare two different parts of her intersectional identity in ways that obviously, per Amanda's call, surprised a lot of people?
Yeah, Chisholm really understood the ways in which misogyny and patriarchy is, embedded in almost everything a part of our society, right? And she understood how people, men and women, saw her ability to run for office, the questioning of her intelligence, her mental acuity, all of those kind of things. She understood it through the prism of sexism and misogyny. And, she thought of it, understanding that racism was pervasive, and indeed it was, but also how important it was for us to understand and grapple with sexism and patriarchy. And so in particular for women in politics, she tries to create and carve a way that allows women to kind of speak freely about the ways in which being in the halls of Congress or being in the state assembly also isolated her from a number of her colleagues. But she would also still, what I say to people too, is she also still put people to the test in regards of their racism, and also talking about the ways in which women, in particular white women, needed to step up their understanding of the lived experience of marginalized people, and in particular Black and brown women. So she was never happy with being the only one to be included, whether it be in a leadership conference or panels. She said that it is a requirement of women who are invested in feminism, to, in particular, white women who have a certain privilege, to understand the lived experiences of others and not only kind of exceptionalize Chisholm as being the only one, but understanding that feminism is for everybody, as Bell Hooks would say.
And so we come to the year 1972. Shirley Chisholm would turn 48 that November. The Vietnam War was raging. Richard Nixon was running for re-election. George McGovern would get the Democratic nomination for president. But Shirley Chisholm made history running as the first black woman to seek a major party's nomination. Here's a classic 1 minute from her campaign kickoff news conference.
I am not the candidate of Black America, although I am black and proud. I am not the candidate of the women's movement of this country, although I am a woman, and I'm equally proud of that. I am not the candidate of any political bosses or fat cats or special interests. I stand here now without endorsements from many big-name politicians or celebrities or any other kind of prop. I do not intend to offer to you the tired and glib cliches which for too long have been an accepted part of our political life. I am the candidate of the people of America.
And one more clip from Shirley Chisholm's campaign kickoff news conference, answering a question on why it would be important to have a woman president or have women in politics generally.
Do I recommend a trend for more women, and specifically black women, to enter into politics, elected office? Yes, I definitely am feeling and recognizing that as a result of over 20 years in political life, only emerging 8 years ago publicly, that there is a great need for more women in the political arena. I happen to believe that there are certain aspects of legislation that probably would be given much more attention if we had more women's voices in the halls of the legislatures on the city, state, and national level. And legislation that pertains to daycare centers, education, social services, mental services, the kind of legislation that has to do with the conservation and preservation of the most important resources that any nation has, and that is its human resources.
Shirley Chisholm running for president in 1972. And Kevin in Denver remembers it. Kevin, you're on WNYC. Thank you for calling in.
Hey, thank you, Brian. Hey, thank you. It's especially just listening to these clips, and I hope you had something from that convention, the McGovern, Muskie, Humphrey, thing, to hear her talk there. The stuff that I heard, it just like really prompted me. I had just turned of age where I could vote. That was the first election I voted in, and I voted for her. But really, because of how she struck me as not being marketed, like everybody else was, but the things she had to say were the same thing, I guess, that a lot of the guys were saying, but it seemed more genuine and authentic and sincere. And, maybe because I was like, I'm still idealistic today, but as idealistic as I was back in 72, it just really struck me and resonated with me. And it's kind of sad that we haven't moved the needle an inch since that day.
Certainly haven't elected a black woman president. At least it hasn't moved in that respect. Kevin, thank you for that memory. Here's one more clip from the campaign.
So I realize that this is a rough road, but a catalyst for change in a society is usually persona non grata with those who have been the beneficiaries of the system. A catalyst for change has to be able to withstand the insults, the humiliations, the abuses, and the slurs. What's wrong with my running for president of this country?
After all, for 15 years, I have been the ghostwriter for a lot of them.
And one more oral history call, remembering the 72 campaign. Jeff in Ridgewood, you're on WNYC. Ridgewood, Queens, or Ridgewood, New Jersey, Jeff?
Ridgewood, Queens.
Hi.
Hi. Well, I was in high school in 1972. My best friend and I decided we were going to take photographs of every political candidate, and we went to a Chisholm rally in Los Angeles. That's where I lived, and there were like a couple hundred people there, and my friend and I and my high school girlfriend were the only white people, and we were blown away. It was so different than the way other politicians talked. Even liberal anti-war politicians just had a a political way of talking about it. And she was so upfront and so clear, and it just completely blew our minds. And also being in a black space like that certainly was the first time I'd ever done that. So that's my memory.
What did you take away from being a white person in a largely black context? Anything you can put into words all these years later?
Yeah, it was like abstractly, I was for integration and equality for black people, but it was so real and so, it just woke me up that, from my comfortable middle class upbringing, that I had no idea what the issue was really about.
Jeff, thank you so much for your call. So, Dr. Fraser, few clips from the 72 campaign, few memories from our callers. In retrospect, what was important about Shirley Chisholm's 1972 presidential campaign? Because certainly she didn't think she was going to win, I presume.
No, she didn't necessarily think she was going to win, but I think she also thought that she had the possibility of really changing the political agenda during that 72 election. I think initially she thought she had a chance at winning. So I don't want to say that. But I think, of course, later down the line, when there's, of course, a lack of resources, she didn't have the same amount of money that a number of her, opponents did. But she also, approaches 72 as what would an election look like if I was able to mobilize a multiracial that went also across economic, backgrounds. What would it look like if I created a coalition? And I tell people the coalition that Chisholm is trying to form across party, well, not across party lines, but across race and identities and ethnicities, right? She's trying to mobilize young people. We can see that from the callers that we had today. She's mobilizing because that's their first election as 18-year-olds, right? She's mobilizing indigenous coalitions, women, the Black coalition, of course, Hispanic and Latino coalitions. And she's saying, what would it look like? And in many ways, she was like, this is the coalition of those who have been, outside of the political realm, who haven't been talked to, who haven't been embraced. Their ideas have been really, ignored by the current administration. She's also mobilizing a large peace contingent who's against the Vietnam War. And the Vietnam War is literally the first speech that she gives when she gets to Congress. And so that coalition is the same coalition that gives birth to a Rainbow Coalition for Jesse Jackson. It's the same coalition that we were able to have our first African-American president with Barack Obama, right? These groups of people, what would it look like? What would democracy look like if you're able to have all of these people come together to really reimagine who should be at the top of the ticket? And so while she didn't necessarily think that she could win, she thought that she was also have a ability to gather enough delegates, right, that she can influence and impact what the platform was for the 72 election with McGovern. And so that is her strategy. And in many ways, she did really well. I tell people all the time, until Kamala Harris, went to Chicago and for the nomination, Shirley Chisholm was the only Black woman who was able to even get to a convention. When Kamala runs for the first time, she doesn't get to the convention, right?
So give me, I know, last 30 seconds. Kamala Harris did not run at all or hardly at all on identity and marginalization compared to Chisholm making it front and center on behalf of a number of groups in 1972. Tell me if you disagree with that framing, but otherwise compare and contrast or highlight Chisholm's influence on Kamala Harris all these years later. We have 20 seconds.
Well, having spoken to a number of her staffers, and she asked for a speech of Chisholm's from the convention. So she's always talked about the importance of Shirley Chisholm really breaking and allowing her to see herself for the opportunity of running for the presidency. So while her campaign did not do that, she drew from Chisholm's legacy.
Zinga Fraser is author of a new book called Shirley Chisholm in Her Own Words, Speeches and Writings, and is director of the Shirley Chisholm Project at Brooklyn College. That's our 100 Years of 100 Things segment for today. Dr. Fraser, thank you so much for being our guide.
Thank you so much.